Hi, folks. Welcome to today's presentation. So, last week we spoke about the psychoanalytic approach, some of Freud's theories, concepts, and today, this presentation, we're going to move to the Neo-Freudians. Now, what are or who are rather Neo-Freudians? Neo basically means new, and it exemplifies the new school of thought within the psychoanalytic school. And so, whatever theories and concepts Freud had proposed, those fall under the classical psychoanalytic school of thought. But the Neo Freudians are people who originally began under the classical psychoanalytic school of thought, but they dissented because they didn't necessarily agree with everything that Freud said. And so these people are called Neo Freudians, or these pioneers are known as people who are originally from the classical school of thought, but then they move towards the contemporary psychoanalytic way of thinking, which includes more components than Freud had originally proposed. And so, in today's presentation in particular, we're going to look at four Neo-Freudians. There were several Neo-Freudians under this psychoanalytic school of thought, but the four main ones we'll talk about today are Alfred Adler, right here, the first one. Carl Gustav Jung, very popular, this one. We're going to talk about him. And then we have Erikson, and Karen Horney with her little dog. And so let's dive in. So today's presentation entails, first we'll look at the limits and liabilities of the Freudian theory that actually gave rise to the Neo-Freudian movement under the psychoanalytic school of thought. And then we'll look in more detail at each of their individual propositions, each of these Neo-Freudians' individual propositions and their own theories and suggestions within the field of psychoanalysis. And then we'll look at how this psychoanalytic theory applies in real life, the Neo-Freudian theories. And we'll look at the strengths and criticisms of the Neo-Freudians, and then we'll end the presentation with a summary. So, what were some of the limits and liabilities of the Freudian theory that even led to people dissenting to his classical school of thought and starting their own sort of schools? And so, the first point is that theorists rejected the idea that personality is formed by experiences in the initial years of life. So, if you can recall, Freud put a lot of emphasis on early childhood experiences, right? Which does have a lot of truth to it. However, he negated or he didn't really put a lot of emphasis on later experiences of life as well. If you remember Freud's psychosexual stages of development, they pretty much end at the genital stage, which is like the adolescent years. And so it's almost like everything that comes after that age doesn't really matter, kind of a proposition. And that's something that we don't really want to we feel that it's a limitation of his classical school of thought. And so Neo-Freudians in particular, they argued that later experiences are also important in shaping personality. So it's not just early experiences, but later experiences also matter. Maybe early experiences do shape a big chunk of personality. Nonetheless, later experiences also play a role in different levels of degree. So, the second reason why Freudian theory was limited is because, again, in a similar fashion, Freud put a lot of emphasis on the unconscious mind and the person's own sort of psychic factors. However, Freud failed to recognize the importance of social and cultural forces in shaping individual personality. So it's not just later experiences, but now also like social and societal factors that matter, right? So your friends, your parents, like what role do they have in making you who you are as a person? What role does your culture have in making you the who you are as a person. So all of these questions are equally important and something that weren't really covered under the classical psychoanalytic school of thought. The last is that Freudian theory is known to have a negative tone, or is known to paint a pessimistic view, almost like presenting a degrading picture of human nature. And this is sort of what the critiques say, if you look at it. So basically, when Freud says that human behavior, human beings, uh, they are largely controlled by their instincts, by these unconscious forces, right? And he boils it down to sex and aggression. It's sort of like you are simplifying the complexity of human nature and human behavior and human decision making and all of those factors that come into play. And so the Neo-Freudians were sort of more optimistic in this view. They said, okay, well, yes, there are instincts, there are unconscious forces, but you cannot just say that's it. People are much more complex, and there are other sort of factors that also come into explaining why people are the way they are and why they behave the way they do. And so these were sort of the three primary reasons that that sort of demonstrated the limits and liabilities of the Freudian theory, and why it was necessary for the Neo-Freudians to come into existence after. So let's go into the first Neo-Freudian, Alfred Adler, and a little bit about his history before we read about his contributions to the field. So Adler was born in Vienna in 1870. As you can see here, this was his birth and death date years. Adler was born in Vienna in 1870. He was the third of 6 children. His teacher advised his father when he was very young to take him out of school and find him an apprenticeship as a shoemaker. But this episode of Adler's life really shaped him, because he recalls that episode motivated him to become better in school. He studied furiously and soon became the best mathematics student in his class. He went to receive his medical degree eventually from the University of Vienna in 1895. His association with Freud began in 1902 when he was invited by Freud to join his discussion group after Adler had defended Freud's theory of dream interpretation against attacks in the local newspaper. Adler eventually was named the first president of the group that Freud had started in 1910. However, Adler soon got disillusioned by Freud's sort of rock hard thinking about his classical concepts, and he dissented, and he started his own psychoanalytic school of thought known as the Society for Free Psychoanalytic Research, a name intended to express their objection to Freud's required adherence to his theories. And so Alfred Adler is known to develop the approach of individual psychology. So his sort of school of thought is specifically known as individual psychology, and some of his contributions to understanding personality are the notions of striving for superiority based on his own experience as a child where he felt inferior, and then his whole motivation to become better than others is what made him end up getting into medical school, getting his medical degree, becoming better at math, and not resorting to that average life of being a shoemaker or something like that. So he gave a lot of precedence to the striving for superiority. He also gave a lot of precedence to the role of parental influence on personality development, and this is where the societal cultural factor comes in that Freud's classical analytic school missed. And so he talked a lot about parents' influence on personality development, and he also spoke a lot about effects of birth order. Okay, so we're going to dive into those in detail. So striving for superiority. Whereas Freud depicted motivation in terms of sexual and aggressive themes, Adler identified a single motivating force he called striving for superiority. Okay? So remember this, different schools of thought within the um, lenses that we're studying to understand personality, within them itself, there were a lot of propositions when it came to what motivated human behavior. Freud said it was sex and aggression. Adler said it was the will for superiority. And then Frankl later in this in our personality series, we will learn that later Viktor Frankl said it was our will to finding meaning in life. And so each of these people um, had their own sort of take on what was that underlying motivating factor that determined human personality, human behavior, human thoughts and feelings and desires. And so for Adler, it was the striving for superiority. He said the single motivating force that can subsume all other motives is individuals begin life with feelings of inferiority, right? So when a baby is born, the baby is not able to feed himself. The baby is not able to, soothe themselves. They depend on their mom. They depend on their caregivers, right? And so right from the time we're born, we start having these feelings of inferiority, like we're not able to do certain things by ourselves, and then it is the our sort of all individual actions, we aim to establish a sense of superiority over life's obstacles, right? It's not even over other people, but just our own challenges in life. And so the fact that we want to overcome our own obstacles, our own limitations, is what motivates human behavior. He also shared that excessive feelings of inferiority lead to something known as the inferiority complex. And he said that it is good to strive for superiority, but it is equally important to combine the superiority striving with something known as Gefühl. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly. It's actually a German word for social interest. He basically said that, you need to balance the sense of agency with a sense of communion. So, a well-adjusted individual is one who doesn't just strive for superiority, but he balances this with a healthy sense of striving for everyone's care. Like everyone needs to also be um, moving upward with you, not at the expense of putting someone down. And he said a poorly adjusted person expresses their striving for superiority through selfishness and a concern for personal glory at the expense of others. And so, for Adler, social interest combined with superiority striving, it what led to a well-adjusted individual. So when it came to his notions of parental influence on personality development, Adler said that parental behaviors um, that are extremely important in shaping how a child becomes, and they could lead to problems in children's life if they are advocated at either ends of the spectrum. So one extreme end would be pampering, the other extreme end would be neglect. So when a parent pampers a child a lot, they rob the child of their independence and add to the feelings of inferiority, right? So parenting is a very important responsibility, even as budding young individuals who are maybe entering their parenthood soon or whatnot. It's very important to know that before you become a parent, please do take the responsibility of knowing how to be a good parent, reading books, reading skills, reading strategies on how to be a good parent. And the sign, the indication, like the basic, how do you know that you've been a good parent or your parents have been good parents? The telltale way of knowing what is a good parent is when a child or when children are not afraid to share anything with their parents. This is a positive sign. This is actually an indication that your parenting was successful when your child is not afraid to share stuff with you. Okay, that's a very good sign that you have done a good job at parenting. Think about your own parents, think about you if you're already a parent, and how your children behave with you, or how you behave with your parents. And so, going back to pampering, if you've watched this documentary called Crumbs, Mr. Crumb was actually an underground comic creator, and he wrote a lot of like erotic comics, and they showcase a little bit about his life, which is a very, very good example of what a parent shouldn't do to their child, and what a parent should do to their child, to for their healthy functioning. So Crumb's mother, basically, it's a very good example of the Oedipus complex that we had earlier come across in the Freudian presentation. And so, everything that you do wrong as a parent would be to reward your child when they do things that must not be rewarded, and to punish your child when they do things that must be rewarded. So it's kind of like opposite. So um, if an over pampering parent who is afraid that the child will leave her and then she will feel insecure, or the father or mother, it could be either of them, but let's just say, for the sake of psychoanalytic and Freudian school of thought, let's just say the mother, right? The mother is afraid that the son or the kid will go away from her. So what she will do is she will inadvertently do everything in her way that will inadvertently cause her own children to lose their wings. They cannot go out and be autonomous individuals, because if they try to be independent, she will punish them and say, why are you doing that? You don't have to do that, I'll do it for you. For instance, like, why are you tying your shoelace? Like, I'll tie your shoelace for you. Don't do that yourself, right? So that's the type of very pathological pampering behavior. And on the other side of things, when a child is doing something bad, um, like, let's say, is rude to someone who he should be respectful to, and the mother says, well, it's okay, you're just having a bad day, it's not your fault. So when a parent does behaviors like this, which is like, you know wrong type of parenting, it's like, what needs to be rewarded is punished, what needs to be punished is rewarded. That, and in a disguise of pampering, just to keep the child with you, keep the child protected under you, and not give them those wings that will shape them to fly out into the world as autonomous, independent young beings. This is what leads to pathological parenting, pathological um, pathologies in children. And so the whole documentary on the Crumbs is basically showing how the mother kept the kids um, in this pathological parenting environment, over pampered, never allowing them to, like, be independent on their own, and what it led to. One of the sons became like a serial rapist. The mom had three sons. One of them was Crumbs. Crumbs got lucky because he had this like underground type of talent, which eventually made him famous. But one of his brothers, he died because he got depressed, and he took his own life because he was just not able to function well in the community. His youngest brother, he became like a pathological rapist, and then Crumb luckily got away, but still had a lot of trauma, trying to come out of that type of parenting. So pampering, over pampering, is never ever good, and it can really influence how a person's personality is shaped. So that's one end of the spectrum. Now, the other end of the spectrum is neglect, right? So children who receive little attention from their parents. Now, fun fact, UNICEF, the United Nations Children Education Fund, I think UNICEF Education Fund. Yes. So, anyways, it does a lot of research on children and things like that. and children's health and stuff like that. So UNICEF, it published a study which looked at the repercussions between neglect and abuse. And guess which one is worst? Is it neglect or is it abuse? Well, research found that neglect is worse than abuse because, in fact, both are equally bad. But if you really have to choose, neglect is way worse than abuse because neglect, at least in abuse, the child has formed some type of neurogenesis has taken place in the child's brain. They have developed, these neuronal connections, which then get perturbed, then get destroyed, and disintegrated because of environmental or societal circumstances. That is abuse. But in neglect, what happens is the child is not even provided with the basic conditions of life to even form those neuronal connections. And so it's even worse than abuse because the child isn't even given the chance to even have this type of connection in their brain, which really, really damages the child in the long run, especially if you're aware of the research on critical periods and sensitive periods. If a child is robbed from developing a certain part of their brain during a specific period of their life, then they cannot do that for the rest of their life. That critical period, that window of opportunity has passed. And so it's very important to know that neglect is much more harmful than abuse because neglect doesn't even provide the necessary conditions to have those basic sort of connections that are formed in our brain, those basic neurological sort of developments. So, if you've heard of the cat blind study, the blind cat study, they actually did an experiment where they stitched the cat's left eye, and when the kitten was born, they stitched the left eye, and the cat was blind with one eye. And after the cat became, I think, 1 year or 2 years old, they unstitched the eye, and the cat was never able to see again with the left eye that was stitched because the developmental period for those cells in the eyes to work passed. And so even though the cat wasn't really blind, she passed her critical stage of developing those necessary conditions to be able to see. And so the cat was blind forever in that one eye. And that's a very nice example of exactly what happens when you're not given the necessary conditions to grow in a certain specific period of time. So neglect is also the other end of the extreme end of the spectrum as well, where children who receive little attention from their parents, they become cold, they become suspicious, and as adults they're incapable of warm personal relationships. And so just think about it. Put yourself in the shoes of a child who, as a child, needs to be shown that they're loved, needs to experience that secure attachment style, right? But imagine if your parent or you've grown up in an abandoned environment, then your ability, your adaptiveness to survive in that specific situation comes from you becoming sort of distant from society, sort of suspicious, sort of not that trusting. Why? Because previously when you trusted, you got hurt, you got rejected, you got abandoned. And so you have this underlying default state of thinking where you sort of don't really trust people that easily. You tend to be colder, more suspicious, you're afraid of becoming attached to people in healthy ways. And so when you grow up and you haven't resolved this yet, those fears come into romantic relationships, and they can really be very, very damaging. You could form something like avoidant personality styles, or even anxious. You get anxious, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we go to the attachments and all those, when we touch upon those theories later during these personality series. But today let's just keep it to neglect. And so pampering and neglect both are equally unhelpful to develop a fully functioning healthy child. And this was one of the things that Adler had proposed. Adler had advocated for this. So the last thing that he was famous for was birth order. So there isn't so the new research hasn't really buttressed this theory to that extent. However, from a commonsensical point of view, Adler did a very good job of advocating for this birth order theory. He said that the order of birth is very important as well in terms of how the child becomes, what personality they develop. So he proposed that firstborn children are the ones who are most of the time subjected to excessive attention from the parents, and then the arrival of the second child ends the pampering. So the firstborn child feels a strong perception of inferiority, such as I'm not good enough, or my parents don't love me enough, or thinking in that angle. And then among firstborns, as a result of these experiences, they often grow up to become the problem children, or the neurotics, the criminals, the drunkards, the perverts. And these are sort of the things that Adler thought, not necessarily buttressed by research in today's world, but it makes a lot of sense based on the observations that he did make at that time. Now, middle-born children, remember Adler was a middle-born child, so there could be a level of bias here. However, he was objective and observant to a large extent, so we could also take this. Um, we could also value this proposition to a large degree. So he basically said that middle-born children develop a strong superiority striving, because they're neither here nor there. They tend to be the highest achievers. They try hard to catch up with their older sibling, and so they have this strong superior striving, and they tend to be most successful in society. The last born children are the ones who are pampered throughout their childhood, and again, those strong feelings of inferiority come up, the sense of dependence stays there, and so all of these factors, sort of the birth order, shape you into who you are. Also, according to Adler, second born children will spend a lifetime trying to catch up with their older siblings, and that's something that's important to remember, because that's also something that triggers the development of a strong superiority striving. Adler, he himself had it, and that's what resulted him in becoming successful in his life. So next we're going to touch upon Carl Gustav Jung, Carl Jung in short. We'll talk a little bit about his history, and then we'll go into his contributions within the field of Neo-Freudian psychoanalytic movement. So, Jung was born in 1875 in Kesswil, a small town in Switzerland. Jung was a Swiss psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, just so you know. So, growing up, he was a highly introspective child who kept to himself, largely because he felt no one would understand the inner experiences and thoughts with which he was preoccupied. Jung spent many childhood hours pondering the meaning of the dreams and supernatural visions he experienced. When he was 10, he carved a 2-inch human figure out of wood. He kept the figure hidden, spoke to it when alone, and sometimes wrote to it in secret codes. During his teenage years, he was preoccupied with the feeling that he was someone else. And so he began a lifelong search to identify what he called his number 2 personality. And we will soon learn about, what Jung came to call as the persona, the mask that people wear, because this is something that Jung kind of realized at a very young age, that there was some aspect of him that was like a second person. It wasn't really him, but it was like a second person, something he was projecting onto the world. He was very precocious as a child, seems like, based on his history. So Jung's desire to understand himself led him to the young field of psychiatry. He earned his medical degree from the University of Basel in 1900 and then went to Zurich to study with Eugene Blauer, a leading authority in schizophrenia. Later, he worked in Paris with Pierre Janet, who was conducting pioneering work on consciousness and hypnosis. Naturally, Jung's curiosity about the human mind soon brought him into contact with Freud's work. Remember how Freud was also interested in hypnosis? Well, you can see sort of their interests overlapping here. Jung's curiosity about the human mind brought him in contact with Freud, and Jung read Freud's book, The Interpretation of Dreams, and Jung began a correspondence with Freud. When they finally met in 1907, the two men are said to have engaged in a conversation that lasted 13 famous hours. So Jung was the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He became very close to Freud. Freud was like a father figure to Jung, and Jung was and Freud was Freud also thought of very highly of Jung, and Jung became his sort of son figure. However, again, because of Freud's staunch, rigid type of um, adherence to his own classical concepts of psychoanalysis, um, Jung and Freud had disagreements, which resulted in his resignation from the association in 1914, subsequently establishing his own school of thought known as analytic psychology. And so, remember, Adler's school of thought was known as individual psychology, and Carl Jung's school of thought was known as analytic psychology. Just out of interest, I will share that Jung, in fact, never wanted to form his own school of thought. The whole crux of his theory was that people need to find their own authentic selves, the process known as individuation, right? Finding your own inner core. And so, although his theories and concepts and research was becoming very, very popular, very, very famous, people put a lot of pressure on Jung to start his own school of thought. And for a long time, he detested this, and he said, no, I'm not going to do that. But his work was just way too good to be unrecognized, or to not have his own kind of school. And so he did end up eventually giving in and establishing his school of thought known as analytic psychology, in which he obviously proposes and advocates for people discovering their own authentic side, not following Jung's footsteps, but following their own sort of inner journey to discovering their true authentic selves. So, after his resignation from the society and his disagreement with Freud, there was like a huge sort of rift in this strong relationship that he shared with Freud. So what Jung did was he spent the next 7 years in virtual isolation, exploring the depths of his own unconscious. He immersed himself in his fantasies, dreams, and visions in an effort to discover the true nature of personality. Scholars disagree on whether this was a period of voluntary introspection or a lengthy psychotic episode. Jung emerged from these years of introspection with a new theory of personality. He devoted the rest of his career to private practice, traveling, reading, and studying. His observations during these experiences, combined with his continued introspection, resulted in numerous volumes and lectures. Jung described in detail conversations with the figure he called Philemon. So Philemon was a famous figure that Jung often had detailed conversations with. In his own words, Jung said, I held conversations with him, and he said things which I had not consciously thought. Jung wrote, for I observed clearly that it was he who spoke, not I. I went waking up and down the garden with him, and to me he was what the Indians call a guru. And so it's kind of like you can see here that some may call Jung as going through this psychotic episode. However, you can also see that Jung was finding within himself having conversations with this higher level of consciousness, which kind of led him, directed him in the direction that he needed to go within our field, that has influenced so many people at large. So one of Jung's greatest contributions to the field was known as the collective unconscious. Remember how within the Freudian school of thought we talked about the unconscious, the preconscious, and then the conscious mind, right? If you remember the iceberg analogy. However, Jung said there's more to it than that. There is something also known as within the unconscious mind. It's not just our personal unconscious, but it's also the collective unconscious. It's things. It consists of thoughts, images, and psychic characteristics um, that are difficult, but they can be brought into awareness. They're never repressed completely out of consciousness, and they are inherited unconscious psychic characteristics. He called these the primordial images, which are also referred to as archetypes. So Jung described these images in terms of a potential to respond to the world in a certain way. Each of us was born with this unconscious material, and it is basically the same for all people. So the reason he called it collective is because all of us have this sort of shared unconscious mind, and in these common collective archetypes, like these cognitive structures that we all carry as our human race. So let's say the father figure, the sorcerer, the good mother, the the bad child, the hero, the villain, the adversary. All of those are these like archetypes of potentialities that exist in all of us within our collective unconscious. And so people are comfortable saying a baby instinctually finds its mother, or that humans naturally have a fear of darkness. Among the many archetypes Jung described were the mother, the father, the wise old woman, the sun, the moon, the hero, God, and death. So in short, the collective unconscious are these things that we inherit from our own ancestors. Just as we inherit our genetic, our physiological characteristics, we also inherit these psychic characteristics that make us sort of find this common ground across humans. And we'll look more into detail in this. So these were Jung's words. In addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals. So let's explain it through pictures. And this is going to be very interesting because pictures make everything fun and more interesting. So far we know that Freud talked about the conscious mind, and then which was like at our state of awareness. Then comes the subconscious mind, which is sort of like not really always something we're aware of, but we can easily pull into our awareness, which is like right here, not too far away from the surface. And then we have the unconscious mind, which is way down deep, but it's like the biggest chunk of your mind, like shaping you, based on the classical psychoanalytic school of thought. And then below the unconscious mind is what is sort of an all-encompassing the collective unconscious, which is what brings the whole human race together, right? So how come people from different cultures speak about the same myths, right? There's a myth of the hero, the adversary, and so it's got something to do with the collective unconscious. And so if you look at Jung's the theories that Jung proposed, you will see that there is the outer world and the inner world. The outer world is the world, the society, the culture that the person interacts with. So imagine that this ball is you as the person, okay? It can be your mind, it could be you yourself. This is like a symbolic you, okay? Now this is your persona. So persona is like the mask you portray to the outer world, right? The persona, the mask you choose to wear that you show to the outer world, which is based upon your ego, right? What is socially acceptable is what the ego sort of modulates. And so, based on the ego, the persona is formed, and this is what is exhibited into the world. Now, the self is sort of in the center, okay? So the persona and the ego lie in the realm of consciousness, the conscious mind. So if you see in this picture, the persona and ego would be like in here in the conscious mind. And then when we go deeper within the mind, which is like we're going deeper down into the iceberg, this is sort of the unconscious realm, okay? Now, within the unconscious realm, you have something known as your personal unconscious, right? So your own sort of repressed thoughts, emotions, dark desires. That's the shadow, right? Things that we repress. And we don't even know, but it kind of like guides us in some ways, in many ways, if according to Freud. But Jung called this the shadow, the hidden parts of the person, the hidden parts of the self. And then he also proposed something known as the anima and the animus. So anima is the female part of the male, and animus is the male part of the female. And so all of us have both of these masculine, feminine sides in us, which come forth to varying degrees. And so this is also part of the unconscious. Now, the collective unconscious is the fact that we all have this shadow side to us. We all have the anima animus characteristics. We all have those collective archetypes that I just spoke about that are exhibited in world myths, world cultures, the fables, the stories, the tales that have been passed down for generations. That's why if you look at Marvel comics, if you look at DC comics, if you look at, all of those movies like Thor and Spider-Man and, Captain America, all of these are sort of characteristics or personalities that are found in our collective unconscious. That's why they appeal to the masses, because we all are aware of these archetypes, right? The hero, the villain, and so on and so forth. So this part is what forms the inner world, okay? And this is sort of hidden from our persona, the outer world. And Jung proposed that the self is the integrated persona with the hidden parts of us. So whatever is the conscious, when it comes in balance with the unconscious, we call that the individuated self. So when our personal consciousness, our collective consciousness, and our personal unconsciousness and our collective unconsciousness meets, it comes together, it's known as the self. And so if any one of you have heard of the word mandala are like these drawings that people often do in mental health clinics, even just for relaxation purposes, for mindfulness and things like that. The mandala is a symbol, is a very ancient symbol in which it's kind of like the person keeps drawing circles, and then they come back to the middle. So they start off from the middle, like let's say you draw a flower and then you draw more flowers and then you draw, but it's always like in circles, and then whatever you do, your sort of drawing always comes back to the center, So Jung proposed that the mandala is a symbolic figure is a symbolic sort of representation of the individuation process, which basically means that just as the self, no matter what experiences you have in life, all of them are sort of bringing you to your authentic integrated core, the self, right? It is the integrated self. No matter how deconstructed or disintegrated you might be, once, like the mandala symbol, it always comes back to the center. It always comes back to the center, to your core. And so the self is a representation, just like the mandala symbol. No matter where you go, what you do, your individuation, it's all leading up to you understanding yourself, this inner core. And so remember, even in life, just sorry for going on a tangent here, but I just really need to share this. So even in life, remember, whatever is happening, regardless of how good or bad it is happening in your favor. It's teaching you more of who you are meant to be. So always remember this. No matter how painful a situation is, no matter how sad or depressed you are in the moment, you are always, always, always coming back to your core because as a result of those experiences you are learning more of who you are, and it's all happening at the end of the day in your favor. So this is just a list of those important archetypes. So anima is the feminine side of the male, animus is the masculine side of the female. Anima and animus guide the selection of a romantic partner and the course of the subsequent relationship. Shadow is the negative side of personality. It's located both partly in the personal and the collective unconscious. So this is another figure. If this is you, this is your ego, your conscious self. Then a little more hidden is your persona, your self-image. Then a little bit more is your subconscious memories. Then a little bit more deeper is your shadow, your psychic material. A little bit more is your opposite sex qualities. And then a little bit more and way down deep here is your collective unconscious, your universal and archetypal processes. So what attracts this woman to a man and this man to each other? According to Jung, these two have projected their anima and animus onto the partner and have apparently found a good fit. So one might ask, well, okay, Jung proposed all of this collective unconscious stuff, but what is the evidence, right? So the evidence is based on examination of mythology, cultural symbols, dreams, and statements of schizophrenics. It is argued that the collective unconscious is same for everyone, okay? Now, what does he mean by statements of schizophrenics? So there is an example here. A very famous example from Jung's work. He said that one day I came across him there. Okay, so he expresses the dream of a psychotic patient he once had. And the patient described to Jung this dream. And the dream goes like this. One day, I came across him there, blinking through the window up at the sun, and moving his head from side to side in a curious manner. He took me by the arm and said he wanted to show me something. He said I must look at the sun with eyes half shut, and then I could see the sun's phallus. If I moved my head from side to side, the sun's phallus would move too, and that was the origin of the wind. This is from 1936, 1959, his work published back then. But this is sort of Jung demonstrating a dream that his patient had. He wanted to understand what this dream meant, right? It's a very confusing dream. It's like he's looking at the sun has a phallus, the phallus is shaking, and then it's causing the wind, and that's how wind is produced. It's all very symbolic. It's all very like esoteric to understand, right? And so Jung said a few years later, he was reading Greek mythology, and he came across a description of a tube-like element hanging from the sun. According to the myth, the tube was responsible for the wind. And Jung asked himself, how could such an image appear in both the hallucinations of the patient and the stories of the ancient Greeks? Like, how could the same symbol be in both places at once? Like, how could the psychotic patient see a dream which has a similar symbol, as well as Greek mythology has a similar symbol? Jung maintained that the image existed in the collective unconscious of the Greek storytellers, as well as in those of psychotic patients, and therefore in the collective unconscious of us all. And so these were the kind of discoveries, not just in isolation, that Jung made, but a series of sort of realizations and observations that Jung made over his entire course of life that led him to understand this notion of the collective unconscious. If you are interested in reading more of Jung, do take a book at something known as The Jung Reader, written by David Stacy. It's a really good book. it makes Jung's theories and concepts very easy to understand and digest, especially because a lot of them wrote in German or in other languages, and a lot gets lost in translation. And so this book does an excellent job of sort of interpreting Jung's collected works and all of these things in very clear, um, friendly English language. So it's called The Jung Reader by David Stacy. Now let's move on to the next Neo-Freudian. It's Erikson. And a little bit about Mr. Erikson. Eric was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1902. Now, the reason I'm sharing all these Neo-Freudians' childhood and personal histories is because part of like understanding personality is also to be able to understand the person as a whole, to be able to, I want you to be able to also, assess personality, not just by the contributions made to our field, but also by the through the lens of the people themselves, like where they came from and to what degree their own personalities manifest in their um, in their contributions and their con- concepts, in their propositions that they made towards our field. And so that's why it's very important for me to share also a little bit about their histories, so I can teach you how to think from a personal personality point of view. So Erikson was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1902. His father was Danish, abandoned the family before Eric was born. 3 years later, his mother married a Jewish physician, Theodor Homburger, and for many years told her son that Dr. Homburger was his real father. It was not until he was an adolescent that Erikson learned the truth, that his birth was the result of an extramarital affair, a fact Erikson kept secret until he was 68. His travels eventually brought him to Vienna and into contact with Anna Freud, who was Sigmund Freud's daughter. She was a noted psychoanalyst herself. It was the summer of 1927. Erikson was a young artist wandering around Europe, took a job in a school established for the children of Sigmund Freud's patients and friends when he came across Anna Freud. Except for a Montessori teaching credential, his psychoanalytic training with Anna Freud was the only formal education he received after leaving home. Erikson fled the rise of the Nazis in 1933 and settled in Boston. He held positions with numerous universities, including Harvard, Yale, the University of California at Berkeley, and the University of Pennsylvania. His first book, Childhood and Society, was not published until 1950, when Erikson was nearly 50 years old. And so, Erikson believed that ego is a relatively powerful, independent part of personality. And his school of thought, his main emphasis was on ego psychology. So we learned about individual psychology, we learned about analytic psychology. Now we're moving on to Erikson, who proposed ego psychology. Erikson was very interested in the concept of the ego that was originally proposed by Freud, and Anna Freud took much interest in that concept as well. He said that the principal function is to establish and maintain a sense of identity. And identity crisis is when confusion and despair we feel when we lack a strong sense of who we are. So a lot of people, especially if you are struggling with borderline personality disorder, a lot of the times what happens in this disorder is that people struggle with their own sense of identity, of who they are as a person. And so remember remember Erikson's own childhood experiences. His mother told him later that his own father wasn't his own father, and he was a result of an extramarital affair. And imagine how much of an identity crisis that could cause for a child. And so for him, it led him to become very interested in understanding ego psychology and understanding, what shapes a person into who they become based on society, based on societal factors, based on how they're supposed to function in a world full of people and cultures. And so Erikson's stages of personality development he's known mostly for that, personal development throughout the life cycle. So we know that to Freud, personality development, for most parts, ends with the superego which appears at about age 6. In contrast, Erikson maintained that personality development continues throughout a person's lifetime. He outlined 8 stages we all progress through, each crucial in the development of personality. So, whereas Freud saw the ego as the mediator between id impulses and superego demands, Erikson believed the ego performed many constructive functions. To Erikson, the ego is a relatively powerful, independent part of personality. For this reason, Erikson's approach to personality has been called ego psychology. People with a strong sense of personal identity are aware of their uniqueness, what makes them special, and maintain a strong sense of continuity with their past self and what they imagine is their future self. The often overused and misused term identity crisis comes from Erikson's work. So, Erikson's stages of personality development continue from infancy to old age. Every stage has like a turning point, which he called crisis, where people encounter some type of crisis, which leads to their personality development. That crisis provides two directions in which to proceed. How a person resolves the crisis determines the direction of his or her own personality development. And so we're going to go across these different stages of Erikson's stages of development. And a lot of you must have heard of this before, but you'll see that it has 8 stages: the infancy, toddler, early childhood, elementary school, adolescence, young adulthood, and old age. And all of these have different crisis points, and you can move in either direction based on the crisis was resolved properly or not. So, basic trust versus mistrust is what develops between birth to 1.5 years of a child's life. Child whose needs are met develop a sense of basic trust. Infants who never receive the loving care they need develop a sense of basic mistrust. What we spoke about before in the neglect and abandonment slide. Autonomy versus shame and doubt is something that people develop between ages 1.5 years to 3 years old. Autonomy is when allowing children to manipulate and control what they encounter. People with a sense of autonomy are confident. Overprotection of children hinders development and leads to shame and doubt. So if you overprotect the children, don't allow them that healthy level of autonomy, then they become dependent on others and they're not that confident in themselves. Initiative versus guilt is something that's formed between the ages of 3 to 5. Children who organize and participate in social activities develop a sense of initiative. People who lack initiative feel guilty and resign. Okay, so you should allow children in between these years, 3 to 5, to be able to take initiative, go out, do things to sort of develop that sense of competence, or they will feel guilty and they will resign. Then comes industry versus inferiority. This happens between ages 5 to 13. Industry is when, a person believes in one's strengths and abilities. Develops when children experience success, right? Between those ages, when you start achieving success, when you start getting good grades, you start getting complimented at home, you start believing in your strengths, you start believing in your competence for industriousness. Inferiority, on the other hand, is when you're not appreciated for your talents, your skills. So children start encountering failure, which is not met with like healthy level of resolution, and then they start feeling inferior. Identity versus role confusion. It happens between 13 to 21 years old. People with a sense of identity make decisions about personal values and religious questions. Failing to develop a strong sense of identity leads to role confusion. So here I'm just going to pause for a second and I'm going to tell you how important it is to be able to establish a solid foundation in your life. And what is a solid foundation? It's one where you're able to have a solid sense of identity of who you are as a person. Remember, you can get everything you want in your life. You can make all your dreams come true. Everything, all your desires, all your wishes, everything in your life can come true. But you have to be able to, first and foremost, establish a core foundation, a solid core foundation, which takes the form in your sense of identity. Once you know what your identity is, you're able to orient yourself in the proper direction. And when you are able to orient yourself in the proper direction, you move towards fulfilling your wishes and desires. So the very first, the basics of understanding or fulfilling what you want from your life is to be able to establish your core, right? Your foundation. And this foundation, it begins with your value system, so values that get passed down from your families, your ancestors to yourself, followed by um, your sort of wishes and commands, like which direction you are oriented towards. And then you can have the strong sense of identity which guides you to move in certain directions of your life. So your core consists of the value system and your vision for the future, your proper orientation in the proper direction. And so it's very important to have a strong sense of identity, because this is the thing doesn't that prevents you from feeling like you're all over the place. If you're at a university level right now in your life and you're still confused about your life, it's very important to establish this core self. And that's why it's important that you have that before you even enter the stage. The intimacy versus isolation is the next stage, and this comes between 21 to 39. When you don't know what your core is, it's very easy to get into relationships which can be harmful in the long run. So young people search for special relationships to develop intimacy and grow emotionally at this stage, but a lot of people who don't even know what their sense of identity is, they fail to develop intimacy and may face emotional isolation. So it's very important for you to understand this your own core before you enter intimacy versus isolation. Do you see how these stages sort of develop over each other? So it's like the previous stage is needed for the future stage to be successful, as well as the current stage to be resolved successfully. So more or less, it's along those lines that you have to think when you conceptualize Erickson's stages of development. Now, generativity versus stagnation was the next stage of development. It was from 40 to 65 years of age. It's middle-aged individuals develop a concern for guiding the next generations. That's generativity, right? When you know that you've achieved a lot in life, you've successfully proceeded through all those other stages of your life, and now you're like, okay, I know where I am, and now I'm going to think about the common good of society, the common good for my children. So adults without children play an active role in raising their nieces and nephews, for those who don't really have their own kids. Adults who fail to develop a sense of generativity suffer from a sense of stagnation. The next is ego, integrity versus despair, and this is something that happens beyond the age of 65. So people who look back on their lives with satisfaction develop a sense of integrity, right? You look back and you're like, wow, I have a family, I have kids, grandkids, everyone's adjusted in their lives, and you feel a sense of satisfaction. Versus failure to develop a sense of integrity falls into despair and express contempt for others. Have you ever seen that movie called Carmageddon, or I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but Carmageddon, not Carmageddon, something like that. So anyways, it's basically an old grumpy man, right? Carmageddon, that's the name for an old grumpy man. And it basically means when you're not, satisfied with your life, overall you can end up becoming this old grumpy person, and I'm sure you don't want to become that old grumpy person. So ensure that every stage of life is dealt with in its own proper way. I do also want to share that as we move towards the future, I think these timelines are becoming a little more higher up. So before, let's say, if ego, integrity versus despair was 65 and above, maybe now it could fall as 75 and above, because people are taking more time to, um, you know, like much more than before. Say at 20s, people got married before, now people are getting married at 30s. So I think even these stages, look at them through um, the view of presentism. Okay, look at, try to evaluate them through your own, through our own current state of affairs. Now the next person we're going to talk about is Karen Horney, and she's also a very interesting person, a very interesting Neo-Freudian. And you will see that she's a woman, right? We've been talking about all these male figures, very few women, but she's one of those women who really made their name in a male dominated world. Psychoanalytic was a very male dominated world, although now there are much more feminine, much more females in our field than males, so it's a very interesting turn of events. A little bit about Karen Horney. So Karen Danielson Horney was born in Hamburg, Germany, the daughter of a sea captain and his young second wife. From her earliest years, she faced the injustices and rejection that came from being a rebellious woman in a man's world. Karen responded to these inequalities by vowing in elementary school to always be first in her class, and at age 12 decided she would one day go to medical school. She worked at Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute and later immigrated to America, where she joined the New York Psychoanalytic Institute in 1934. However, it was not in Horney's character to check her growing dissatisfaction with Freud's theory. So, Horney studied Freud's theory and worked and taught psychoanalysis. However, she was dissatisfied with how inflexible his theories were, and the open questioning that she did created a great strain with other people who were part of this institute, who in 1941 voted to disqualify her as an instructor. According to most reports, Horney received the vote in a dramatically silent room. She responded by leaving the meeting in a dignified and proud manner without uttering a word. Horney went on to establish her own highly successful American Institute for Psychoanalysis. By the time of her death in 1952, it was clear that she had made great progress in her battle against male-dominated and paternalistic psychoanalytic school of thought. And so Karen Horney founded American Institute for Psychoanalysis, and two of her most important contributions were neurosis and feminine psychology. So Karen described neurotic people as those who are trapped in a self-defeating interpersonal style. Okay, remember how we spoke briefly about the five-factor theory of personality, where we spoke about neuroticism as one of the factors of personality. And neuroticism is basically when people are carrying their emotions on their sleeves wherever they go. So they're ready to sort of you know burst out in flames, kind of a thing. So it's when you're with neurotic people, you would feel that you're walking on eggshells because anything can just trigger them. And so neurotic people have very hard time with interpersonal relationships. A lot of borderline personality types are also neurotic, and it's a type of personality that develops because early childhood you had a lot of instances which were traumatizing, and so you always have to be up and about. You have to be sort of sitting at the edge of your seat because anytime anything bad could happen. And so this is a specific type of personality. And so Karen Horney said it prevents people from developing the social contact they unconsciously crave. They have destructive interpersonal styles, and it's a defense mechanism. This destructive interpersonal style is, in fact, a defense to ward off feelings of anxiety. So they feel so anxious that something wrong would happen or something bad would happen that they will have this destructive interpersonal style, that they would become hostile, they would create hostility just to ward off the anxiety that they're feeling. It arises due to disturbed interpersonal relationships during childhood. Now, the interaction styles adopted by neurotics to avoid anxiety provoking experiences can be divided into three types: needy, hostile, and distant. So, people who are very neurotic, who are getting anxious quickly, are try to cope with it by developing three different types of um, personality styles. So, one is needy. So needy is one where you move towards people, right? So some children deal with anxiety by emphasizing their helplessness. They become dependent on others, compulsively seeking affection and acceptance from their parents and caregivers. Moving against people, these are the hostile types. One way to handle anxiety is to cling to others, right? Another is to fight. So under the hostile, people are ready to fight. Some children find aggressiveness and hostility are the best way to deal with poor home environment. And last but not the least, you have the distant types. These are ones who move away from people. So some children adopt a third strategy to deal with their anxiety. Instead of interacting with others in a dependent or hostile manner, the child may simply tune out of the world. Who needs them? That's the question they ask. The desire for privacy and self-sufficiency can become intense, right? So they become so distant. They want to be private. They want to be self-sufficient because the anxiety of being with someone is very is very heavy. It's very intense for these people. And so it's a type of neurosis to be in these different stages: needy, hostile, or distant. So feminine psychology introduced the concept of womb envy. Okay, so under feminine psychology that Karen Horney proposed, she wanted to sort of contend with Freud's concept of penis envy, which we learned under the Oedipus complex theories. Penis envy is basically when Freud said that women are jealous of men having penis, so they start identifying with the mother and being attracted to the male figure, like looking up to the male figure, something like that. And so remember again, guys, like don't be hard on Freud here. Freud was functioning during the Victorian era when indeed it was a very patriarchal society, and it was a time where it's not that Freud thought less of women or something like that. It's just that in that time where women were so repressed, any woman would you know want to be a man, not because he had a penis or not, but because he had more sort of freedoms to go out, work, express themselves. So who wouldn't want to be like in that position at that time? It's probably not even got to do with men or being a man or a woman. It's just what it symbolizes more freedom of expression. And so that's where Freud was coming from. So don't be harsh on Freud, calling him a misogynist or things like that. You have to sort of also look at it from a contextual point of view. And so Karen Horney was also proposed something similar, but she said, okay, so it's not just penis envy, but men have this womb envy. So men envy women's ability to bear and nurse children. That's why women are superior, because women can give birth, and men are jealous of this fact because men can't do that. So to compensate for this inability, men, what they can't achieve in person, they achieve outside. They become good at achieving professionally whatever they have to achieve in professional lives and other domains of their lives and things like that. So in a society where men and women are free to become whatever they desire, girls would not want to be boys or vice versa. So next we're going to move to the applicability of psychoanalytic theory. So, Freud's perspective, and here we'll talk a little bit about psychoanalytic theory and religion. So, remember, Freud wasn't, he was very scientifically oriented back in his time, even though, like a lot of his theories are criticized not to be scientifically um, proved or scientifically like validated. However, he was very scientific in his orientation. He did not really believe in religion, and his view was that religious behavior represents a form of neurosis. Religion is a type of collective wish fulfillment. God is an unconscious father figure generated to provide feelings of security, right? So these were sort of all of his thoughts. So, if you ask the question, why do people feel deeply about their religious beliefs? This is one of the questions addressed by Freud and many Neo-Freudian theorists. Freud declared religion a delusion, whereas Jung pondered the nature of religious experience throughout his career. According to Jung, religion provided a sense of purpose and security. People seek psychotherapy when religion fails to provide reassurance. Modern religions have developed practices to provide assurance like confession, absolution, and forgiveness. Now, Eric Fromm is also a new, like a very well sought after pioneer. He was a German social psychologist, psychoanalyst, sociologist, humanistic philosopher, and democratic socialist. And Eric Fromm was born on March 23rd, 1900, at Frankfurt, the only child of Orthodox Jewish parents, Rosa and Naphtali Fromm. So remember this, guys, like all of these people are, so this psychoanalytic movement is very European in nature. It came from Germany, Vienna, Austria. These were like the origins of the psychoanalytic movement. While in America, it was more pragmatic, it was more the behaviorist, more scientifically oriented. We have Skinner here, we have Watson, we have all of those more um, evidential, scientific, lab experiment kind of um, propositions. So, Eric Fromm's perspective when it came to religion and psychoanalytic was that people turned to the powerful authority of church to escape a sense of powerlessness and loneliness. He also provided a distinguished between authoritarian religions and humanistic religions, and it's something I find too in a lot of like in the world religions. So a lot of the Western religions, or even like in England and Britain, religion is very criticized because it's very authoritarian in its nature. People are under An authoritarian basically means people are under the control of a powerful god. They have to obey to this god or they will be punished. It denies people of their own personal identity. But if you look at the Eastern cultures, like the Indus Valley culture, the Chinese culture, which is more spiritual in its orientation, the religions there are more humanistic in their nature, and where God is a symbol of our own power. Like, it's not so much that we have to be subjugated to this power of God, but God is something that is within us. It's what provides the power to us. So it's a symbol of our own power, and it provides an opportunity for personal growth, right? So this is the difference. Now let's move to the strengths and criticisms of Neo-Freudian theories. The strengths are that it elaborates on vital concepts that were ignored by Freud. There is an identification of societal factors that influence the formation and change of personality. It's more optimistic and it gives a more flattering picture of humankind. There's an introduction of new concepts like identity crisis, introverts, and inferiority complexes. The criticisms are that Neo-Freudian theories are supported with questionable evidence. So even though they have all of these very helpful, holistic kind of theories, there's still a lot of like lab-based experiments that need to prove these theories based on our modern day scientific outlook on things. It's oversimplified or ignores important concepts, right? Again, there's more complexity to the human nature that these Neo-Freudians too touch upon. So here are some summary slides that you could read on your own. which basically summarize today's presentation. Feel free to read them on your own. And that's it, folks. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. All the best.